Hello and welcome to the second webinar in this new PyQ series, Intelligence for the Future. I am Alison Jones, Director of Practical Inspiration Publishing and host of the Extraordinary Business Book Club. It's very, very good to have you here. The aim of these webinars is to explore how work is changing in these unprecedented times and give us the insights and the strategies and the skills to help us navigate that transformation better. And we've got some brilliant practical inspiration speakers lined up over the coming weeks. If you have a particular topic that you would like us to cover, or if you have any feedback on how we can make these sessions more useful, do drop me a line afterwards. It's alison@alisonjones.com. So a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce today's speaker. I'm just going to turn off the video there. Hang on. There we go. So your audio and your video should all be off. And we'll just keep it that way. It's partly to preserve the bandwidth for Anna and myself, partly to avoid random underwater sounds and distractions. But if you have comments, questions, concerns, just put them in the chat as they occur to you. And I'll do my best to pick them up. And I'll either invite you to put them to Anna yourself when we come to the Q&A session, or I will put them to her if we're running out of time. So this session is being recorded, just checking, it is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the full thing afterwards. And I'll also be putting the talk, not the Q&A bit, but the talk that Anna and I will do up on the Practical Inspiration YouTube channel and on the PyQ e-learning platform. Right, that's the housekeeping. So let me introduce today's speaker. Anna Meller is the UK's leading work rebalance expert. She works with ambitious professional women seeking to balance corporate career with family life, empowering them to make choices that work both for them and for their employers so that they can progress their careers and their employers also retain key talent. Anna has an MSc in Occupational Psychology. She's a Chartered Fellow of the CIPD and a founding member of the BPS Division of Occupational Psychology's Working Group on Work-Life Balance. And she's also, of course, the author of Upcycle Your Job, The Smart Way to Balance Family Life and Career from Practical Inspiration Publishing. So welcome, Anna.
Hi, Alison.
It's really good to have you here. So tell us, Anna, how do we find work-life balance in this new normal?
Right, well, thank you very much for having me on this webinar, and thanks to the people who have joined us. I want to be really valuable to you for the next hour. So as Alison has said, any questions, anything I don't cover, do put in the question box. Well, first of all, for me, as I see it, this isn't yet the new normal. This is for many working mothers and for some working fathers as well, I know, really their worst nightmare. This is the bit that's been going on behind the scenes that has put so much pressure, and particularly, let's be honest about it, women do 75% of the caring in our society, and that's hidden and unpaid caring. So for them, it's been a case of that running through the back of their heads the whole time. What happens if my childcare collapses, if I can't get my parents, for example, to pick up the slack, etc. And suddenly here we are. This is what's happened. And so for many women, I think they are really struggling to work things out. And that's going to take some time. But I'm hoping that what we can do as a result of this is take an opportunity to create a new normal, which is so much better in terms of how we integrate work and life.
And what do you think needs to happen if that's going to, because it's interesting you say that, because I think quite a lot of people are seeing this, it's awful, you know, the stuff that's going on is really, really hard, but actually that somehow there's an opportunity in here to make things different, to make them better.
There absolutely is, Alison, and I think for the purposes of today's seminar, what I want to do is share three key things that individuals need to do, and some of these arguably should fall between individual and employer, but hey, if your employer's not going to do it, it's your work-life balance, then it's down to you. And the first of those is you really need to look at how you're working and how your job is structured, and maybe even think about redesigning or rethinking that job. And I know that sounds a bit radical, but up until recently, the majority of jobs have been offered on the basis of hours worked for pay rewarded, and also the longer rewards of promotion, etc. Now, that might work in some areas. For example, if you're a customer services assistant, obviously you need to be in a job for a certain number of hours. But for a lot of us, it's more about outputs. It's more about how we use the best skills, the ones that we've been hired for, to get the outputs that are really going to make the most difference to our employer. And unfortunately, what also happens is, for a lot of us, things get in the way that are not particularly productive. And we know what a lot of those things are. You know, they're the usual suspects that take up a lot of time, but don't actually add very much to the results at the end of the day. So I think now is the time to actually find a few moments, and I know for some people this can be quite difficult because you've got so much going on around you, to actually sit down and to think about what are the key things that you were hired for, what are the key outputs that are required from you, and maybe have that conversation with your manager as well about what are the key things that are expected from you beyond, well, you should be working 7 hours a day or whatever it is. And I know it's a big ask to get women to do that. That is one of the things that really, in an ideal world, employers should be doing. But just to reassure you, the research has shown that people do this the whole time, and they do it in a number of ways. The one that's been most researched is something called job crafting, where people tinker at the edges of their jobs. So they do look at things like, what's taking up a lot of my time but isn't productive? What can I do a bit less of? Who is helpful to me? Who is not helpful to me? And changing the way that they structure their jobs. So just to give you an example of that in practice, I had a coaching client, Lisa, who was PA to the CEO of a division. Now that sounds like a sort of fairly minor role, but actually it was one of these big, it was more like, you know, the person who's the secretary to the president or whatever. You know, it's a big role in itself, managing the projects for the CEO. And she very often couldn't get into those projects because people knew she had the CEO's ear. So they would send her all sorts of trivial things to answer. You know, can you do this for me? Can you answer that for me? Where do I find that? And we sat down for a coaching session, and I said precisely this to her. So what are the, you know, all those little things that are getting in the way of you actually achieving? And she said, well, mainly it's other people's emails. So we agreed that she would put a message on her email signature for the next 2 weeks saying, I can't deal with your query right now. I've got a really important project I'm doing. If it's urgent, email me again in 2 weeks' time. And of course, in 2 weeks' time, I met with her to say, well, how's it going, Lisa? And she said, you know, 90% of those have gone away. I can actually focus on the work I should be doing, which was, you know, not a surprise to me, but a surprise to her. But I think sometimes, and I'm going to talk about boundaries later, but sometimes we need to put those boundaries in. We need to identify what are the things we should be doing rather than trying to be all things to all people and doing everything. And again, I'm going to be speaking a bit more about that later on.
If I can just interject for a second there, actually, Anna, just a funny story is that I used to work with a very senior chap in publishing who never answered emails. And I challenged him on this because I was going mad, you know, as I was emailing, he wasn't responding. And he said, well, I never respond to the first email. If it's important, they'll email back. And he said, you know, 80% of people, it goes away and they sort it out themselves. And the arrogance of it, you know, still kind of slightly rocks me, and I find it incredibly annoying as a colleague.
Yeah.
But I also thought, that's quite smart.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, it's interesting that you know, it can be seen as arrogant, and particularly if a woman was doing it, it would be, well, why is she not available? But as I'm going to be saying later on, I think we need to rethink both what we expect of ourselves and what we should let other people expect of us, and that you know, if it's a strategy that works and it makes sense, then maybe that's the strategy to adopt. And if you have time, and I know not many people have time at the moment, and you want to see how an outputs-focused work environment might work, there's a great book you can buy on Amazon called Why Work Sucks and How to Fix It. And I think it's Callie Resler and Jodie Thompson, but if you Google the title, you'll certainly see it. And in it, they talk about all the work they've been doing in the US for a results-only work environment and the sort of infrastructures that they put into place. And it's worth looking at, because if you are thinking more about being output focused, then it gives you all sorts of things you can think about in terms of doing that.
There's another interesting book actually by Rob Baker called Personalization at Work, I think it's called. It was going to be called Job Crafting, but that's in the subtitle.
Yeah.
I remember I talked to him about this when he was writing. It's published by Kogan Page now, and he talks a lot about that. Job crafting is a really interesting, psychologically, the engagement, the productivity is huge, but it's also about, it's not just about what you like doing, it's also, how can you express your unique skills and strengths, and how can the company really make the most of those, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. And job crafting, along with the two other processes, are ones that particularly have been interesting work-life balance researchers, because obviously if you decide you're going from 5 days to 3 or 4, and particularly if you're in a senior role, it's not simply a case of, oh, well, we'll just chop some of it. It's about how do we shape it to be the most efficient role that we can. And again, job crafting has the most research. There's also something, if you want to Google it, called I-deals, and there's research on that, and that's individual deals that people do with their managers to say, these are the bits of the job I'm going to focus on because that's where my skills lie, because that's where I'm needed, etc., etc. And the third one, which is just beginning to come in, but I think is going to probably, I was thinking about this morning, and I think it's going to be much more prominent after the this whole pandemic is over, for a whole load of reasons I don't necessarily want to go into at the moment, but it's called reduced load working. So again, one of my heroes who wrote the foreword to my book, Professor Ellen Kosek, is doing a lot of stuff researching how reduced load jobs are structured, again, so that they're productive, rather than this perception of, well, so-and-so's not working so many hours, they can't possibly be doing as much as other people, etc.
Yeah. I've just had a quick note from Paula privately saying, could you please note the title of that book? And Paula, we will. Once I've got the transcript, I'll put on the email afterwards the titles of the books that we've talked about, because they are great resources. Yeah. But Anna, you might have that sense that, actually you're not working as efficiently as you could. They're not getting out the best of you because they're asking the wrong things of you. But how do you flag that upwards? How do you have that conversation?
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, the first thing is you need to have a structured process where you've done the thinking. What is it that you are, what is it that you are best at, where is life unproductive and whatever. And for people listening to this webinar or this podcast, or listening into it as a recording, the easiest way to do that is either have a look at my book, and I've asked Alison to reduce the ebook to 99p for until the end of the month. And in the book, I do offer a structured process where I get people to think through, right, okay, what are the key things that you need to do that use your skills in the best way? What are the things that you could perhaps automate, delegate, or even drop altogether because they're unproductive? And then what can you develop as the business case for doing that? So not just the benefits to you, but what would be the benefits to the organisation, and particularly to your manager, of doing these sorts of things. And that, as I say, is in my book. It's also I've also put that into a workbook, which has proved quite popular. It's a free workbook that you can download from my website. And again, the link will be in Alison's comments if you sign up to my newsletter. And that would just take you through simply that bit of the process, rather than the entire work-life balance thing. But it will get you thinking about what's productive, what's unproductive, how can I change it, how can I prepare myself to negotiate a better deal.
Yeah, and make it work for them as well as you.
And I think that's the key, is making sure that it's not just about you, it's about getting people to buy into that vision of how it could be better for your team, for your manager, for the organisation. Because then obviously when people have that, they're thinking in the positive, they're not just focusing on, oh, well, how much extra work is that going to be for me? What's the rest of the team going to think about it, etc.
Yes, there's a big change inertia thing that you have to overcome with the return on investment argument, isn't there? So you
Yes.
talked
Yeah.
about redesigning your job. That's the first bit.
Yeah.
You said
Yeah.
what's the second bit?
Right. Well, the second bit, and I know this is going to challenge a lot of people at the moment, they're going to go, how on earth can I do this? Is putting in boundaries. And for most of us, one of the things that had been happening anyway, and even had its own hashtag on Twitter, is that the current technology we have was leading us to more and more always on working. So the temptation was, right, okay, I've got a few minutes, I'll just do this for work, etc., etc. And our boundaries were being eroded. And that's not good for two reasons. The first, the simple practical reason, is that multitasking has been shown to be ineffective. Because essentially you are not doing two things at once, you're switching your brain between one and the other, and there's an adjustment period because you're not a computer, you can't do that parallel processing, so you're going to be slower if you're doing two things at once. Now I know, at the moment we've got children at home, we've got things on our minds, we've got work, etc. So people are going to be tempted to multitask, and there are going to be times when they do that. But there's another good reason why you shouldn't do that, or why you should put some boundaries in at least. And that is because of something that psychologists call conservation of resources. According to psychologists, we all have finite resources, whether they're physical, emotional, mental, etc. And once those resources are exhausted, that's when we feel exhausted and we're not really fit for anything. So what we need to do is we need to set in periods of recovery time. Now, recovery time doesn't mean lying flat out in a darkened room with a wet towel over your head. Recovery times, just to be clear, but recovery, you can recover by doing something other than what you've currently been doing. So you switch from, say, a challenging mental task to going for a run, you switch out of work mode. And how many of you, when you switch out of work mode and do something like go for a run, or like me, do some yoga, or even do some cooking or do something else, suddenly the answer to what you were thinking about comes into your head because those resources are being replenished. So for those two reasons, we really need to think about having some boundaries.
And of course, what's interesting is in the traditional workday, those boundaries, if you go out to an office, those boundaries kind of happen automatically. You have commuting time, downtime when you're traveling, you have coffee break in the morning. They're kind of baked into your day. Even hanging around before a meeting, chatting to people. You've got to invent them from the ground up at home, haven't you?
You have, and it's interesting you say that, Alison, because I was looking at Twitter yesterday and I actually came across a tweet from someone, and she had some endorsements as well saying, I'm missing that commute. Because that commute gave me time. And again, going back to my coaching clients, the client I was talking about who did the email thing, she also was concerned about how much her work was eating into her evenings. She had a family. Her husband was the prime carer for the children because his job allowed that. But she felt when she came home, she wasn't present. So she would, we agreed again that she would finish her work on the train going home. She would then get herself into a mindset of family time, and she would then when she was home, spend time with the family. So she was able to put those boundaries in. Now, I recognise we're talking about a different time in our lives. I recognise that right at the moment, those boundaries are incredibly hard to manage. But again, I'd go back to Ellen Kosek, who is a leading authority on work-life balance, who says that the problem with 21st century ways of working, and particularly the fact that we're all encouraged to blend, integrate, it's all about work-life integration, isn't it? She says, no, because that leads to job creep, because it's the job bit that tends to be the bit that people worry most about and do the rest in the background. So we do need those boundaries, and I've been saying I recognise that it can be hard to put in, big boundaries, But again, there's a lady at UCL, Anna Cox, who is doing research into human-computer interaction, who talks about micro-boundaries. So rather than saying, right, okay, I'm going to spend the next 2 hours doing X or the next hour commuting, we can have small boundaries. For example, we can decide that there's going to be an hour of family time on the weekend when we're just not going to deal with work at all. We can negotiate with our partner, if we're fortunate enough to have a partner, or maybe with older children, that for the next half hour I'm just going to focus on work and nothing else. We can choose to switch our phones off or put them into night mode when we sleep. So, there are these little things that you can do which are micro boundaries, but the more used you get to doing them, research has shown, the more likely you are to do them and also to see the positive effects of them.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and it really ties in with the whole behavior design piece that's so hot at the moment. That actually, if you want to achieve something big, you do tiny habits and you do them consistently and you build them up. And if you, as you say,
Yes.
it's not a case of this is my day and it's in hour-long blocks. And actually, it's just about finding the red lines, isn't it? And building up from there.
Yeah, and we I think we have actually got we have got so into this, we can work anytime, we can connect to emails, etc. anytime, we can use technology anytime. And it does remind me of a lovely joke my sister posted on Facebook, or shared on Facebook, which said, extend the life of your phone's battery. And then it said, put the thing down.
You've got to find what works for people. That's the motivation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Veronica's just sent a message as well for everybody. A good book is Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud and John Townsend, which I don't know. So
okay, I don't know that one either, but
another good book recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that one. Yes.
So we've talked about designing a job. You've talked about building in those boundaries. You said, but there was three things. What's the third one?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. And the third one is we need to look at the way we play those two key roles of parent and worker or employee. And again, the social scientists have this concept. It's called role theory, as you'd expect. It's not the role play that you get with cosplay. It's a completely different thing. But it is. It does talk about how we have roles, and those roles have expectations. So, as a mother, there are expectations put on me about how I will behave with my children, about what I will do in terms of running the home, etc. Those are all the expectations around me being a mother. We have expectations about what it means to be a good employee, particularly if you're ambitious and you want to progress. And in a lot of cases, those two sets of expectations tend to be at odds with each other, primarily because work is still structured on the basis of the 1950s, where you had a man who went out to work and that was his only focus, and you had a woman who was at home and that was her prime focus. So you had one very clear role. Now, when you have these two roles that often don't mesh, we used to have what was called role conflict. And that was the bit where you had to stay at work for a meeting, but you also wanted to be at your child's afternoon event or play or whatever. So the two roles were in conflict. And we used to talk in the work-life balance field a lot about how can we harmonise those two roles? How can we get more role harmony, role integration, by looking at the positives of the two and bringing some of the positives from each role to the other. So, for example, toddlers are great at teaching you negotiation skills. Try negotiating with a 2 or 3 year old. Going in to negotiate with a difficult manager is going to be a piece of cake after that. So, we can think about how we transfer those skills. And that's been historically, something that work-life balance researchers would talk about. What's happened in this current situation is we've got something else going on, which I term, and this is my own term, it's not in the literature yet, called role confusion. And one of the things about roles is we have a cue and we act in a certain role. So you're at home and you're with your children, you're playing the role of mother. You're in the office or you're in your home office, you're working and you're playing the role of employee, and you know what that means. Now, in the current circumstances, you could be in a situation, and I know from looking at social media that many people are, where you're working at the kitchen desk while your other half is trying to amuse the children, or there may not be another half, and you're worrying about what the kids are doing, etc., etc. So you're muddling all these roles at the same time. You suddenly get a work call, you suddenly have to switch into that, and what happens is we get an element of what psychologists have called cognitive dissonance, where we're trying to balance all these roles together, and it takes an awful lot of mental energy to do that and to keep switching between those roles. So if you can be a bit clearer on what is expected of those roles, then that makes life a little bit easier. But what that means is that you have to rethink what it means for you to be a professional working parent at the moment. And before the rest of you lovely people joined us, Alison and I were just talking about interruptions, and of course the one we all know about, that great BBC interview where the guy's trying to give a really serious answer to some economic question, and suddenly his toddler comes in on one of those baby walkers. And, in the past that would have been, oh gosh, that is just so unprofessional. But maybe we need to think about what we mean by professional. And maybe professional now has to mean talking to your colleagues or clients or anybody else and saying, look, I am also a working parent. I have got children of whatever age at home. I may be interrupted. If I am, I will call you back as quickly as I can, or reschedule this call, because obviously I'm trying to do my best here for you, but I also need to look after my family. So it's about being more open and more honest, particularly about all that hidden caring that we have done and tried to pretend isn't happening because we are professionals, because our professional role is the only thing that we're focusing on.
It's so true, isn't it? And actually, we've been doing it for years. So yes, I mean, that's so iconic, that BBC video. It still makes me laugh every time. The guy's face just drains of colour. But yes. I mean, how can honestly say that they haven't had felt guilty leaving a meeting because it was a domestic thing, and almost pretended it was, I don't know, picking the car up from the garage, or something that was less gender specific and less focused on domestic roles, because we have to try and squish that bit down.
Yes, absolutely. And the sad thing is that I'm seeing on social media that there are still employers who are believing that, who are expecting people to work as though they didn't have those children at home, even though they have. And I think, again, I was talking to Alison before we started about Caroline Criado Perez's great book, Invisible Women, which talks about all that caring work that women do that is hidden, that is never seen, and that increasingly, as I was saying, was leading to always on working, particularly for women, and which has done us no favours. But of course, when women entered the working world in huge numbers, we only had a male playbook. We didn't have anything else. Now we can begin thinking about, how do we rewrite that? How do we bring more of ourselves into the workplace and say, well, these are experiences outside of work that are important, and this is all part of who I am, and I embrace that as a professional woman. I don't have to pretend that that's a low priority, or somebody else is always dealing with it.
And Ruth has just made exactly that point actually in the chat. She just said, now's a good time to experiment with bringing more of the true you to work. It is.
Yeah. Thank you, Ruth. And I'm very keen. I'm glad that you're thinking along the same lines as I am on that, Ruth, because I think this is one of the things that so often makes women drop out, because they say, I've got this dreadful work-life balance anyway, and I can't be myself at work, and they don't accept that, I'm equally committed to my career and my children. So I'm going to drop out. I'm going to do something freelance or whatever. And yes, all of those people contribute to the economy, but just think how much more powerful you could be if you got into some of those more influential roles in the workplace, if you stayed there and managed to change things. So yeah, great.
And what's really interesting to me as well is that a lot of the things that you're talking about, being more conscious about what's really important in your job, being clear about your roles, but also acknowledging the fact that one doesn't end when another one begins, that you are all these things sort of simultaneously, and these things are expected of, and being more conscious about that. These aren't just skills for coping in a pandemic with work. These are life skills, aren't they? These could actually, we can take these forward into the rest of our working lives.
Oh, absolutely. And again, this is one of the things I say in my book, where I do give a long skills list of things that are needed for work-life balance. And every one of them, including some of the ones that we've looked at today, like assertiveness, managing boundaries, a deeper self-awareness, these are all skills that are valuable through life. And if you've got your sights set on progressing your career, they're skills that are going to be invaluable as you do progress your career, because they're the sort of skills that you need. So yes, this isn't just about managing your work-life balance, although obviously that's my area and that's what I want to support people to do, but they are great fundamental skills.
And we've talked at the moment, until now, we've been really focused on people who are trying to do both. That they're working from home, that obviously kids are off school and so on, and that's the critical condition, if you like. That's the acute sort of need. But there's lots of other people in different situations, and one particular condition that would be interesting to just talk about for a moment would be if you're furloughed. So if you're furloughed, technically, you can't work. That's the deal. But what do you do? What can you do in that situation?
Right. Well, as I understand it, and the advice, I'm not a furlough expert. My background is in HR, but not in this area of HR, which of course is very new. And a lot of colleagues are kind of really scratching their heads around it. But as I understand it, if you're furloughed, it's for one of two reasons. You can be furloughed because you have childcare responsibilities that make it impossible for you to work. Or you can be furloughed because there is no work for you to do. And I know that's a grey area, because there is some suggestion that in that case you might be able to take on a different role. And I know some people have been volunteering for NHS roles, etc. But one of the things you can do if you're furloughed, and again, this depends on your circumstances and if you have time, is you can do some training. And that's it's been made clear that you are able to be trained, and your employer can train you if your employer wants to. So in terms of work-life balance, what that means is that you can obviously take this time to look at whether there are some skills that might help you improve your own work-life balance. It may be that you want to have access to things like my book or workbook that I was talking about earlier, or access to other books. I don't know how that works in terms of getting support from employers, but you can do things now that will prepare you to have better work-life balance when the pandemic is over. So even if you've been furloughed and thinking, well, this doesn't really apply to me at the moment, do make the most of this opportunity if you can, to think about how you could be working smarter rather than longer or harder once we're out of this.
Yeah, and I think the point about being able to train is really important as well. I know that I'm a member of, I'm on the board of the Independent Publishers Guild. Obviously, we've had to cancel the spring conference, but we're doing an online conference instead. And the wonderful thing is that even if you're furloughed, you can still attend the conference, because it counts as training and continued professional development. So it's really worth investigating those opportunities.
And there are, I was saying to Alison before you guys all joined us, that there just seem to be so many webinars going around at the moment that, you know, even if you can find yourself a few that are of interest to you, lots of people offering free stuff, there's low cost stuff. It's a great opportunity to do things.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just kind of summarise before we go to the Q&A, and I've got a couple of really good questions. Thank you, Ken. I know you just sent one there through as well. Just summarise for us those three key skills, the sort of ways that we can focus our attention to make this work.
Okay, yeah. So what I want to do is I want to just leave you with the thought that this isn't the time. A lot of women are going to be pressured at the moment to think about, you know, I've just had enough, it's too much, I just can't manage it all. And there's a lot of temptation for women to think about packing it all in or taking a breather or whatever. I want to say, don't give up. Step up, and step up in three areas in particular. One is looking at restructuring your job so that it works better for you and for your employer. The second is put in those boundaries, even if they're micro boundaries. And the third is sorry, I've just lost my thread because I saw a message that I can't read.
I'm on the messages, don't you worry about that.
And the third one is obviously to think about what it means to you to be a professional working parent. And are you putting expectations on yourself that are now outmoded, outdated, not appropriate for either this situation or the 21st century.
Absolutely. So the job, the boundaries and the roles that you're putting in, the expectations around them. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thanks, Alison.
I've got a couple of questions that have already come through. And I think, just as we close, perhaps it's really seeing this as an opportunity, seeing this as a chance when all the old rules have been broken. We're having to reinvent things, so we might as well make it work for us and make it better.
Absolutely,
it's quite
yeah.
framing it, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Might not feel like that with you when you're in the middle of the day, but that's great. Thank you, Anna. I don't think there are any more questions coming through. Lots of agreements, but that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Lots of practical and inspiring food for thought there, which is exactly what we want, of course. And of course, if you want to find out more, if you want to look at Anna's process for having those difficult conversations, for really thinking through how you design your job, her book Upcycle Your Job is brilliant, and it's on offer on Kindle this week, 99p, 99 cents. So yeah, do grab that. In fact, I say this week, it's the end of this month, isn't it? To the
yes, we'll keep it like that till the end of April.
Yeah, brilliant. And then just a final few words from me as I wrap up. Do join us next week. We've got Productivity Ninja Grace Marshall on converting in-person training to online training. And the following week, we've got ex-BBC journalist and PR guru Mike Sargent on managing communications in a crisis. And as I said before, if you've got any issues, any topics you particularly like us to cover, then just get in touch, alison@alisonjones.com. And of course, if you'd like to explore becoming a practical inspiration author yourself, I'd love to hear from you. We are very proud to be publishing partners with leaders in a wide range of fields, like Anna, of course, and you can find out more about us at practicalinspiration.com. And then one last tiny plug, the 10-day business book proposal challenge starts again on the 20th of April. So if you have an idea for a business book, if you'd like to take it forward, if you'd like to perhaps win a publishing deal, then do sign up for that. I will put a link in the email that you'll receive shortly with a link to the recording of the webinar, together with all the bibliography of the books that we've discussed today. And I'll also give you a discount code for that. And that really is it. So thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Anna, for fantastic food for thought. It's really, really good to talk to you, and hopefully see you all back soon for another Practical Inspiration webinar.